Targeting enemy.
UFO Aftershock was released in 2005 as a direct sequel to the 2003 title UFO Aftermath. This game expands on nearly every aspect of Aftermath and adds a lot of new features and mechanics. I also find this game quite similar to XCOM2, mainly in its gameplay, but it does have some story similarities, so not to be surprised if this game is one of the inspirations behind XCOM2. Either way, we'll go through this game's story and mechanics and examine them in detail, starting with, as always, gameplay. Unlike its predecessor, you're not able to choose where you start in this game. You'll always start in Germany, or what was Germany before the apocalypse. Aftershock, much like its predecessor's gameplay, mainly revolves around capturing bases and territories on the map. Unlike its predecessor, there is actually a form of currency in this game, 3 kinds of currencies in fact. I'm honestly not sure what these 3 currencies are called. I've tried doing research to find out what their names are, but I've been unable to find their names. If you know, don't hesitate to tell me. But these 3 currencies are essentially your human resources, your cybernetic resources, and your psionic resources. Each of these 3 resources, of course, is used for different things. For example, the base human equipment mainly uses the human resources, whereas more advanced equipment requires cyborg resources, and psionic equipment, of course, requires psionic resources. A large portion of the gameplay of this game is about trying to balance your resources and keep your income up to maintain the demand that is obviously going to increase as you expand and build bases across the planet. So let's talk about bases. Unlike in Aftermath, there aren't simply 3 base types that you switch between. Instead, each base is modular and can have buildings constructed in them as you please. There are 4 different kinds of buildings you can build within bases. They are factories, labs, defensive buildings, and knowledge buildings. All of these are pretty explanatory. Labs are used for research, factories are used for production, defensive buildings train soldiers to protect the base and the territories around it. Knowledge buildings are required in order to build the higher level labs and factories. For example, there may be factories that require a knowledge level of 2, which means you'll need knowledge building of 2 to build those factories. Outside of that, knowledge also increases the defense of the territory from propaganda, as the game calls it, as well as increase your mineral income from territories around the base based on your level of knowledge. Hypothetically, if you wanted to really get resources of a certain type and you had a base with an abundance of those resources, you could build that base up full of knowledge buildings to really increase your income of that resource. The problem is that all bases have a finite amount of space. The smallest bases can only house 3 buildings, while the largest can hold around 6. Adding on to the fact that you often need to build multiple knowledge buildings to access the higher level factories and labs, it can be quite hectic trying to slot everything you need in order to gain access to the research and production you need, because you often want to build more than one lab of a type in order to research that tech as fast as possible. The second mechanic involving bases of note are tracks. In order to receive the income from a province, you must connect that province to your capital in Germany. This doesn't mean you have to connect every single province to Germany, but it does mean you have to connect the bases to it. This will result in you having a long stretching track line through your territory, connecting all of your bases back to the heart or your main base. The tracks themselves are quite costly, not in initial cost, but in upkeep. So you'll often find you're expanding to gain more territory, to gain more resources, but by doing so, you add on to your costs through tracks. It can be quite difficult balancing these incomes and expenditures. And you may have to pick and choose which bases you connect and therefore make active and which ones you leave inactive because the resources within those territories the base surrounds aren't worth connecting to the network due to the cost. For example, in my playthrough, I often neglected territories that provided cyborg resources and tried to avoid connecting them to the network because I had an abundance of those resources and income, making it pointless to attach them, and it would have just driven up the costs of my already small amounts of the other 2 resources. Despite the fact that you have a main base, you do not send your soldiers out from it. Instead, your soldiers exist on a flying island called a Laputa. You move the Laputa across the planet and can carry out missions within its range. In that way, it's quite similar to the Sky Ranger in XCOM2, which you also have to fly around between territories in order to undertake missions in those territories. Due to this, you don't have to house permanent military forces within your bases, which makes them more irrelevant, shall we say, to the actual military campaigns you plan out, as your Laputa flies around, allowing you to attack and defend where you will. Your bases are mainly used for production, research, and resource acquisitions. This is rather different to UFO Aftermath, where your military bases are where your soldiers came from, in their helicopter, and the military bases provided AI-controlled armies who would fight battles for you. There is nothing like that in this game. Now let's move on to research. This game has a rather typical form of research, but it does have something that stands out from other XCOM-likes, in the sense that you need to create different kinds of labs to research different elements. For example, psionic research requires a psionic lab. That's not that outlandish, but even energy weapons require their own lab. You have labs to research basic equipment and then labs to research more advanced equipment. I'm not sure how I feel on this mechanic overall. I'll leave that for my positive and negative sections, but I do have some problems with it, as well as some things I do like. When it comes to manufacturing, it's exactly the same. You have to build manufacturing factories to construct each of the different types. You'll need an energy factory to produce energy weapons, a normal basic weapon factory to produce basic human weaponry, a psionic factory to produce the very psionic equipment, and a cyborg factory to produce cyborg weapons. This, coupled on the fact that bases have limited space, means you'll constantly be pressured on where to build things and trying to make the best use of the space within your bases, often demolishing labs that become useless or factories that you no longer produce weapons from in order to replace them with newer and better alternatives. The final thing of note in the strategic layer is diplomacy. Unfortunately, there aren't big diplomatic impacts in this game, but you do recruit all of your soldiers from the other factions, and your higher your rating with them, favorability wise, the higher the quality of the soldiers they will give you, but of course the higher the cost for recruiting them as well. You can also ask for resources from the factions at the cost of all of your favor with them in return for a larger sum depending on how high your relations with. As I said, unfortunately, nothing really interesting happens diplomacy-wise. Even if your diplomacy score gets all the way in the negative, which I did experience at one point, the faction won't declare war on you or rebel or anything, which is rather disappointing. But again, this is rather similar to XCOM2, where you have three factions that all kind of hate each other and each provide unique units. The human faction, of course, provides human soldiers, the cyborg faction provides cyborg soldiers, and the psionic faction provides psionic soldiers. Since we've about wrapped up the strategic layer, let's move on to the tactical layer and talk about soldiers and how they work and how they fight on the battlefield. To start with, we have three different kinds of recruits: humans, cyborgs, and psionics. The main difference between these classes is in their equipment and their training capability. For example, cyborgs and psionics both have unique equipment that they equip that cannot be equipped by humans, and they in turn cannot equip normal human armor. They also each have their own training path to go down. They each have the cyborg path and the psionic path respectively, but cannot cross over those lines, and humans cannot train in psionics or cyborg technology. This makes both of the classes quite specialist by default. Cyborgs are stronger and with higher health, but cannot equip armor and heavy armor like normal humans can. The equipment they can equip, implants, do increase their base stats though. For example, if you equip a cyborg with a leg agility implant, it will increase his agility, obviously, or an arm strength implant will increase his strength. Cyborgs are the only class that can increase their stats when outside of leveling up. Psionics are largely the opposite. They can't increase their base stats, but their equipment does increase the stats of their other soldiers. For example, there is equipment that makes it so soldiers near a psionic have higher accuracy, or they heal faster. In that way, psionics mainly fulfill the role of support soldiers. They can also carry the least amount of equipment and have the least health, making them an easy target in battle. Outside of these few differences, cyborgs and psionics are identical to your normal human soldiers and can train in whatever they please and use whatever weapons they please. Let's talk about training. So like in UFO Aftermath, you can train your soldiers in multiple disciplines. Unlike in UFO Aftermath, you can only pick 3 maximum. So for example, a cyborg soldier will only be able to pick 2 because he is by default already slotted into the cyborg training, meaning he can then only pick up 2 more kinds of training before he's maxed out his training abilities. Again, unlike UFO Aftermath, training here actually has a big impact, whereas in Aftermath, training only increased stats. Here, training is very important and adds various passive and active abilities. For example, simply using a sniper rifle requires sniper training. And at the max level of sniper training, you gain the ability to target individual parts of a body of your enemies, which is very useful as you can snipe the heads of your enemies, killing them instantly, often at great range. Other classes also have special abilities. For example, the Scout class's special ability allows them to view an enemy's health directly, as well as their statistics. In this way, training is often very valuable as the different skills that come with training offer a big boon in battle. Again, for example, the leadership skill offers a permanent increase to both the attack, defense, and psionic resistance of nearby allies at top level. Another example are medics, who at max level can actually revive the dead. Or ranger, which at the top level allows you to dual wield smaller weapons like pistols or SMGs. The only requirement there is to train in skills is that you have not reached max of your 3 skills, obviously, but you also have a attribute requirement. So let's now talk about attributes. Just like in UFO Aftermath, you cannot directly increase your skills. Instead, you increase attributes that are associated with those skills in order to increase them. For example, strength increases your throwing and close range skills, as well as your hit points and capacity, whereas agility increases your speed, as well as your ability to dodge. I personally really like this system. I liked it in Aftermath and I still like it here. Here, though, you can actually boost stats far beyond their normal capacity, even boosting them up to super heroic and beyond, such as super heroic +1 and super heroic +2, or even super heroic 3 and 4. Characters with stats that high will easily decimate the enemy, no matter what they are or what weapon they're using, provided, of course, that their weapon is in that super heroic category. When your characters level up, they gain 1 skill point that they can use to put into one of the attributes, which then increases their skills. As I said, there's no other way to level up these stats outside of leveling up, obviously, and cyborgs who have the ability to increase their stats passively by inserting implants into their bodies. Now let's talk about the weaponry your teams use. When you start the game, you actually start off using the default alien reticulin rifles, which use energy. But as you explore the Earth and conquer sectors, you'll gain access to human equipment and also begin researching it so you can reproduce it. Funnily enough, human equipment is largely better than the default reticulin gun you have access to at the beginning. When it comes to types of weapon, there are quite a few. There's your long-range sniper rifles, there's normal rifles, there's close-range weapons, which includes melee weapons, shotguns, pistols, SMGs. Then, of course, we have throwing weapons like grenades and grenade launchers. And then finally, we have mechanical, which mainly refers to submachine guns or machine guns in general, any sort of gun that has a high rate of fire and is heavy. Of course, rocket launchers come under this in the throwing section, and there are the various alien weapons you can find, which also come into weird slots. For example, you can get a gun that's very heavy, which requires the heavy equipment skill to use, but it counts as a rifle because for the enemy, it's just a normal gun. There's also a wide variety of human equipment. You have AK-47s, you have M14s, and various other real-world guns that you can use and switch between. Unlike in Aftermath, we can actually craft these weapons and their ammo, so we can keep using them indefinitely if you really want to. Personally, in my playthrough, I ended up using the default shotgun you unlock early in the game up until the end of the game because it was just that good. So what are we going to use those weapons on? Well, there is a total of 5 enemy factions in this game. Yeah, you heard that right. 5 enemy factions. You have the starting mutants and reticulans that populate the planet. Then you have the cultists that appear later on in the game, followed by another 2 alien races which invade the Earth. So there's a lot of enemies with a lot of different characteristics that you kind of have to build your weapon usage around. For example, the mutants you fight first of all are all rather squishy and will die to most normal human conventional weapons, as will the reticulans early game, though late game they gain access to their shields like they had in the last game, which makes them a little more resistant but still susceptible to human equipment. The cultists are actually a mirror of your faction, in the sense that all of their soldiers and equipment are humans, cyborg, psionics, and the default human equipment, which in a way kind of encourages you to prepare for fighting against them. Their uses of sniper rifles makes them a major threat when fighting in the open, and their uses of shotguns makes them a major threat when fighting in close range. In a way, you have to adapt to fight against your own playstyle when facing them. Then we have the extra 2 alien races, who I won't spoil, but both of them have their own resistances and weapon usage. For example, one is very resistant to all form of conventional weapons to the point where one of their units can only be damaged by psionic equipment or plasma or laser weapons. And the other one's units have such high health and sometimes come in mechs that you need to have large-scale damage-dealing weapons like rocket launchers or machine guns to deal with them effectively. All of this kind of keeps you on your toes. You can't really rely on one set of weapons to get through the whole game. I mean, you probably could, but it wouldn't really be a good idea if you wanted to fight effectively. And it does mean your normal human weapons do stay competitive quite later on, as the cultists you'll be fighting from start to finish, and they of course are weak to the human weapons as they are pathetic, squishy humans. The reticulans as well, and the mutants often fought in late game even though they're a starting faction. So let's talk about battlefields. Battlefields are 3-dimensional, as are your characters. The main difference between this and other XCOM-like games is that it follows the mantle of XCOM Apocalypse in the sense that it is real time. There are no turns here. Your units move and shoot in real time, as do the enemy. You often have to maneuver your soldiers around to gain vantage points and spotting for your units so they can snipe and shoot, much like in normal XCOM, but all in real time. You can't just send a guy out to look at the enemy and have him stand there while you take your turn with your other units and shoot them. If you use somebody as a spotter, they will be putting themselves in grave danger. The way damage is used is also different to normal XCOM-like games. Basically, every character has essentially 2 health bars. They have their normal green health, and then they have an underlying red health. When their green health drops to 0, a unit falls unconscious and can be revived. But if a unit's red health drops to 0, they die. This applies to both your units and enemy units, and some enemy units, for example, have passive health regeneration, so you may find you've brought an enemy unit down, left him unconscious, but then his health is regenerated and he's got back up. This again makes scouts very useful, as a scout can look at a downed enemy and see if they have temporary damage that can regenerate, or if they've lost all their green health and are now permanently unconscious. There's also lots of different ways to spot enemies. There are various devices you can use to scan. You can physically see them on the battlefield. And psionic characters have the ability to sense other intellectual beings through walls and across terrain. But some enemies that aren't very intelligent, for example, can't be sensed. They also can't sense droids or mechanical units in this way. Overall, I think the gameplay is great. It's a direct improvement over UFO Aftermath in nearly every way. There are a few things that maybe I'm not 100% on, but I'll talk about those later in a later part of this video. One thing that hasn't been improved on, though, is air combat, which has been entirely removed. Much like XCOM2, the only air combat that happens are scripted sequences where your base is usually attacked. Now let's move on to the story and overall plot of this game. To start with, I will say it's almost impossible for me to talk about UFO Aftershock's story without spoiling UFO Aftermath, as it is a direct sequel. So if you haven't played Aftermath or watched a summary or whatever, then maybe you should do so now. You could watch my previous video, for example. Or if you just don't care, that's fine too, I guess. This game does a good job of rounding up the overall lore of UFO Aftermath, so you could just play Aftershock and ignore Aftermath. But Aftermath is worth playing, so I do recommend it. Alright, so first of all, this game's story takes place 45 years after the bad ending of UFO Aftermath, which I'll assume you're aware of, but I'll round up. The aliens essentially win on conquering Earth. The humans submit and are put on the floating islands that this game takes place on, while the aliens colonize the planet and prepare about the birth of their god, as they like to call him, as they spread the biomass across the surface of the planet. This game's intro shows the people on the floating island ruled by the Council of Earth, who are the protagonists of UFO Aftermath. It seems the station had started to shut down, and so humans do what they usually do and proceed to start killing each other. This leads to even more destruction of the station, which then explodes, with some of the survivors escaping into the ships that are aboard the vessel. Those ships then find another nearby floating island where they land, proceed to kill all of the reticulans living there and occupy it for themselves. This flying island is the one you use for most of the game to carry out your maneuvers on the Earth. One thing of note here that is a little, shall we say, upsetting is that the other floating island was supposed to house the reticulans who originally were allied with the humans. So the fact that we've gone to their island and just killed them all is a little unfair. I suppose the humans of the floating island, since it's 45 years in the future, weren't aware that our friends were on this other floating island, but that will be explained later on in the story anyway. Just know we killed all of our friends from UFO Aftermath. Also, since the Council of Earth, I imagine, all died when the station blew up, the protagonist of UFO Aftermath and the ruling council that were fought the aliens in the first place are all dead, assumedly. As the story begins, we're introduced to the factions on the Earth, the native humans, the cyborgs, and the psionics. All of these factions largely hate each other, but they aren't fully organized factions. They're more like decentralized organizations trying to survive on the surface of the planet. So they don't engage in large-scale conflicts or really fight each other outside of just hating one another and carrying out simple raids. The first thing you start to do story-wise is piece together what happened originally, because the protagonists of this game have no idea of the events of the war or what happened to the Earth originally or why they are on that floating island at all. They do start to piece together the various things that happened in the previous game, though, and eventually you reach a point where you basically know everything that happened in Aftermath without playing it, which is one of the reasons why I think you could just go straight into this game without playing Aftermath, as it does do a good job of telling you the story of Aftermath through the characters you're playing exploring their own people's history, which is a rather interesting way to do it. Not long after you start the game and start taking territories dedicatedly, the cultists will appear. This is, as the name suggests, a group of religious cultists who believe the reticulans were the prophets of a god-like being, which isn't that incorrect, but they now worship that being and see you and your forces as a detriment to that creature's coming, as they say. The masters will arrive on Earth soon. And I think this is where I'm going to call the spoiler warning. Going forward, I'm going to spoil this whole game's plot. So if you don't want it spoiled, it's better to skip ahead in the video or simply stop watching entirely. This game's plot is a little all over the place. I'm not sure if it's that good enough that you'd want to skip and see it for yourself or just watch this video. It's up to you, obviously. You'll have to make your own decision. The cultists behave a lot like you. They actually take territories on the map and begin spreading their influence. They also directly attack your territories and neutral territories and take them for themselves, with you having the ability to, of course, intervene and try and defend neutral territories as well as your own base from their attacks. You can then, of course, go on the offensive and try and take their own territories for yourself. As I said earlier in the video, they are very much a mirror of you and seem to abide by the same laws and mechanics as you. Early into your conflict with the cultists, you'll receive word that an asteroid is approaching Earth at high speeds. You'll then be given a timer of 2 weeks before it arrives to do as much as you can before whatever happens. When this meteor arrives, it reveals the fourth enemy faction, the War Gots, as they're called. The first time they appear, they immediately attack the station, and we get to a space station defense mission. This is one of the few times you actually get to see your base on the Laputa and how it looks. After that, the Wargots become a permanent feature of the conflict on Earth. They do not take territories like the cultists. Instead, they act as support for the cultists. Any territories they take will be handed over to the cultists, and they will often start showing up in missions against the cultists to support them. Basically, they act like a supporting faction of the cultists instead of their own independent group, which pretty much confirms that they and the cultists are kind of allied and working together. The cultists themselves kind of confirm this when they say that these Wargots are the masters that they supposedly are waiting for the arrival of. The game ramps up in difficulty quite a bit here, as Wargots are quite strong, both with very high health and very high damaging attacks, although they are very large, which makes them easy targets for sniping. After this, you start trying to plan an attack on the Wargots' giant asteroid rock that they arrived on, because they did not arrive on a spaceship. In order to do this, you have to build your very own space vessel and steal a communications device from the cultists, which you can then use to allow your ship to get close enough to the alien rock for you to board. Once you do that and get on board, you have a very weird kind of sequence where you have to move through the hexagonal parts of the asteroid and destroy certain areas of the ship in order to destroy the asteroid permanently. During these levels, you encounter the fifth faction in the game, the Star Ghosts. You see them fighting with the Wargots in the parts of the ship, and of course they attack you. Their look is quite strange. They look like various purple things. You have stars, you have these weird floaty things, you've got these giant spiders. They're a very strange looking faction and quite dissimilar to anything we've seen so far. They also have very high resistance to conventional weaponry, with some of their units being completely immune to any damage other than psionic, laser or plasma. Either way, once you've fought your way through the Wargots ship, you blow it up, winning the game, surely. But nope, the game continues. Instead, the Star Ghosts now reveal themselves as the fifth faction, and their asteroid, which seemed to have been hiding a little bit away from the Earth, approaches now the Wargots are gone. It's almost as if with the Wargots defeated, other factions that were hiding in the shadows have now taken their chance to step forward. Although they were flying on an asteroid not dissimilar to the Wargots, which will play a role in the story and plot going forward. Instead of supporting the cultists and expanding their territories like the Wargots, the Star Ghosts actually take territory for themselves. The main difference from the cultists is once they take territory, it cannot be taken back, as they kill everything in the territory and use strange structures to render the land unlivable. This makes fighting and pushing them back vital, or they'll quickly take over large portions of the planet that they're then unrecoverable for you. And then around this time, a Reticulan fleet arrives. It only took them 50 years, which is more than 30 years than they were supposed to arrive, but the Imperial Reticulan fleet arrives to defeat the extremists, which were carrying out this experiment on Earth in the first place. They really are late, but I guess they're here now. You quickly contact them and they agree to support you, but then their ship kind of runs into some trouble and they end up crash landing on the Earth. You do a mission to go rescue them, and then you integrate the Reticulans into your faction, I suppose. Unfortunately, you don't get to recruit any Reticulan units. You only gain access to some extra research, which increases the speed that you research Reticulan weaponry and equipment, as well as some story things, which is a little disappointing. If we were going to have the Imperial Reticulans join us, it would have been a good idea to give us some maybe Reticulan units, like we'd had in the first game. Around this time, your scientists come up with a strange theory. They essentially believe that all life in this situation is essentially being manipulated by these space asteroids, which they believe are actually living beings. That's how they explain how both the Wargots, the Star Ghosts, and the cultists all seem to be serving the narrative of these space rocks, whereas the war ghosts and Stargots are housed on the asteroids and come to the planet. The cultists here on the Earth are trying to support them and are hostile to anyone who doesn't want to support them, such as you. Your scientists theorize it's because these space rocks, which are actually living beings, are here to mate with a female of their species that is apparently here on the Earth somewhere, and that these creatures mind control the native peoples of planets to use them as shock troops, essentially, to fight the native people on the planet as well as their competing male rocks so that they can gain the females. All sounds rather far-fetched, but they conclude there must be a female somewhere, and the only place not explored is on the moon. So then we get our final battle. This level is pretty much exactly the same as the good ending of UFO Aftermath, except with an extra part. Whereas in Aftermath, level ended after you killed 3 slugs. In this version, after killing slugs, you go deep underground and find the female rock, which you then destroy. Your scientists seem to believe that once you kill the female, the star ghosts will simply leave, as there is no longer a female here to them for attack the Earth for, and with the female dead, their mind control of the cultists will end, meaning they'll all go back to doing whatever they did before they became weird cultists. And unfortunately, the game doesn't really explain whether this is true. The game simply ends after this. But at least it's a better ending than UFO Aftermath. We actually were able to get to the root cause of the alien attack. This also reveals a little bit about the Reticulans and explains why the Reticulans seem to have regressed quite a bit since the UFO Aftermath. It's concluded that once the Reticulans finished making the biomass on Earth, that they came into conflict with it, and the female space rock may have killed all of them, or sent out some sort of pulse which rendered them essentially feral, which is why most of the Reticulans you encounter aren't really using advanced equipment and make no attempt to communicate with you, despite you actually being their allies, to both the native old greys and the extremists who you supported in UFO Aftermath. It's concluded that the pulse that the female sent out, which rendered all of the Reticulans this way, was also what summoned the other male rocks to the Earth. Although, if this theory is correct, I do have a problem with it. Essentially, if it's true, why are the aliens attacking the Earth when the female's on the moon? It just doesn't make sense. Well, whatever. It's fine, I guess. That's the end of this game's story. It's an okay story, I guess. It jumps around a little, and it's a little weird with the whole rock breeding being the whole reason for all this conflict. But it'll do, I guess. It does follow the trends of other XCOM-likes, where the whole reason for the conflict on Earth is because of some greater being trying to ascend and using humans as a means to do so, quite like in XCOM2, though I'll avoid spoiling that game just in case. I do appreciate that all of the normal beings essentially aren't really evil. They're all being manipulated and mind controlled by evil space rocks, who on themselves aren't really evil, they're just doing their biological purpose. But anyway, we will now move on to the positives, the things I liked about this game. Overall, I think the gameplay is all around great. It's nice playing in real time, it's nice having all these different factions that you fight, and having all these different equipments that you use. And I quite like the mechanics of actually controlling territory on the Earth, and having to fight and squabble with the other factions over the land. I also really like the leveling system. I've never liked the system in other XCOM games where, for example, you walk back and forth to increase agility. I much like the idea of leveling up and intentionally putting points into each stat like we do here. I do like the idea behind base building. It's definitely interesting and not one we normally see. In normal XCOM-likes where we build bases, players tend to build the same sort of bases. We have the military base, we have the construction base, we have the research base, and we kind of just apply those templates. But due to the bases having various sizes and being various distances away from your main base, and of course your need for each thing changing as the game progresses, you don't really build a base and forget about it. Instead, you'll be constantly going back to revise it and rebuild and destroy buildings as your needs progress, which I found quite interesting. Although I do so have some negatives to say about that as well, but I'll talk about that in a moment. The soundtrack of this game is actually really good. Like, it just is really good. I don't know why no one's ever mentioned it before. Maybe it's because no one's really played this game, but the soundtrack's great. The song that plays during the credits is especially good, and I'm surprised that that song only plays during the credits, considering how good it is. I also like how, like in UFO Aftermath, you rarely have to kill every enemy in a level. Usually, once you kill a certain amount of enemies or achieve the objective, the level can just be ended whenever you like. But you can choose to keep playing and kill any remaining enemies if you like, which is definitely great. I really hate having to kill every single enemy in a level. It just feels strange. Usually, in a real military conflict, you would only kill enough of the enemy for them to run, which is what usually happens here. The aliens scatter or mutants when you've killed a certain amount of them. One thing I'll mention as well that maybe isn't that good is this game does have an autosave, unlike its predecessors. Yay! Alright, let's talk about the things I didn't so much like about this game, or the negative section as it's known as. This game doesn't have any form of Overwatch. It does have Watch, which essentially has your soldier raise their gun ready to fire, which means they can fire much faster than normal as they've already completed half of the task by raising their gun. But there's no form of auto-fire. Every single attack has to be carried out directly by you. Although once you've ordered them to attack, they won't stop until you say, which I suppose is better than having to order every single shot. I experienced quite a few crashes with this game, actually. Nearly all of them were related to doing the main story levels, and this would have been quite bad if it wasn't for the autosaves, and say autosaving after every single level. Or before, I should say. But I still did experience them. Although I'm not playing on the unofficial patch, I'm playing on the official Steam version, just so I could see how the game actually runs and how it would run for most people if they played it. But keep in mind, there is an unofficial patch out there. I wasn't using it, obviously, but I assume it would fix a lot of the problems technical-wise. I do miss the post-apocalyptic aesthetic of UFO Aftermath. I miss the sprawling cities that you had to navigate, filled with zombies, fired humans, and creatures. I do appreciate that this game is a post-apocalypse, so a lot of time you're going through just ruins of the old world that have partially been rebuilt. But as I said, it's a minor thing, but I do miss that kind of atmosphere that UFO Aftermath had. Although I appreciate, we've moved on from it. I still miss it, though. Maybe I'm just a sucker for post-apocalyptic games. Base building gets quite tedious later on, especially because of the way factories and labs work, where you have to constantly be dismantling the ones you're not really using anymore and rebuilding the new ones, and occasionally rebuilding old ones if new tech comes up that wasn't there before. It can be quite annoying. I wish that they gave some indication of when you fully researched all of the tech in a lab, just so you can delete them fully without worrying about, will I need this lab in the future, which you may well need to. Just as an example, early on you have access to jet research, which is required to make upgrades to your Laputa in it, both its speed and the amount of soldiers you can deploy. And then after that, you don't need it again until you have to build a ship to attack an asteroid. This is me trying to avoid spoilers there. So you could go through most of the game having dismantled your jet labs, not knowing that you will need them later on, which is kind of annoying. But I suppose it's kind of what they intended, where you would have to constantly be dismantling the stuff in your base and rebuilding things that you need as your demand happens. You again can't just build and forget about it like in other XCOM games, where you just build your lab base or just build your factory base. I do quite like the idea of decentralized research and being able to focus on one specific brand of research. It always felt weird that, you could only research a gun or you could only do one autopsy, but I just feel like the way it's done here isn't that great. Mainly due to, as I said, the not knowing of when you fully researched. But I'm in two minds about it. On the one side, it's innovative. It's kind of nice being able to just build, military tech labs and dedicating them to military research, and then having your medical lab that's dedicated to autopsies and medical research. But I don't know, I'm not sure. I think it could have been done a lot better. Maybe that's mean of me to be complaining about quality of life in a game from 20 years ago, but it is what it is. All right, time for my final conclusions, or should you play this game? I think that if you're a fan of the XCOM genre, and specifically the older style of XCOMs like XCOM Apocalypse, I think you would generally enjoy this game. The one problem I have with it is it's quite overwhelming, both in the amount of enemies that attack you, the amount of enemy factions, the amount you have to research, the amount you have to build. It's a little much, and I could see it easily intimidating someone who isn't very experienced or someone who isn't willing to experiment and maybe lose a few times. Personally, playing on the normal difficulty when I first played and veteran difficulty now for this playthrough, I didn't really have those problems. But I've played a lot of these sort of games, but I do think it would be a little much for people who aren't ready for the sort of overwhelming tasks you have to carry out and all the plates you essentially have to spin. With that in mind, though, this game is ridiculously cheap. This game is £3.40 or $4, which is ridiculously cheap for the amount of content in this game. And it regularly goes on sale. For example, just on the spring sale that just ended just before this video is released, the game was down to 89 pence or $1. And for that price, I really can't say that you shouldn't play this, even with everything I've said in mind, both positives and negatives. It's just kind of a steal for the amount of content in this game for that price. The game is also available on GOG for the same price and is still on sale right now at the time of me recording this. So if you want to play it, there's no reason not to, really. You can't complain about the price, definitely. Overall, I would say the game's great, as I've said. It is a little overwhelming. I think it does overstay its welcome a little bit, but for the price, you really can't go wrong in my view. And if the unofficial patch fixes the technical issues, then even that is erased as a negative. I really enjoy playing this game. I don't so much like its sequel, but I suppose one day I will have to make a video on it. One final thing is a comparison between this game and XCOM2. Both this game and XCOM2 have you based in a flying ship, as it were. Both have other factions that you can recruit soldiers from. Both are set on an Earth where the aliens won the initial conflict in the previous game. Both have you take territories on the map by supporting local resistance movements, as they were. In UFO Aftermath, Aftershock, they are resistance against the cultists and the aliens, and in XCOM2, they're just resistance against the alien advent. Both have shadowy aliens who are using the Earth and humanity to propagate themselves psionically. Honestly, there are quite a few similarities, but it could easily have just been a coincidence. But I want to believe that this game had some influence on XCOM 2. I mean, it's such a good game with so many interesting ideas that it would be nice to think it had some influence on later games and especially on one of the biggest XCOM games and most popular ones in the franchise / genre, I guess. This is the end of the video. Thank you for watching up until this point if you did. Remember to favourite, subscribe, like, or the opposites if you prefer. If you've reached this point and still haven't watched my UFO Aftermath video, maybe go watch it just to see how it compares to this game. I do think Aftermath is worth playing, even if you play Aftershock first. That game, I think, has a better aesthetic, just because I prefer post-apocalyptic, maybe. Anyway, for my next game, I'm actually breaking the mold a little, and it'll be a newer game. I'm a little unsure, as I've only made videos about decades-old games at this point, but I suppose I'll have to bite the bullet. There are newer games that deserve some covering, we should say. So your hint will be for the next video that it was released in 2024. That's right, last year, and is currently sitting on mostly negative reviews on Steam. It's also a space game, and honestly, that's enough hints. If you can guess, don't hesitate to. I'll acknowledge your guess if you're correct, and pin your comment or like it or whatever, and you can feel proud about guessing what should be a very obvious guess, honestly. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.